Rome, 1987. A room on the third floor of a building near the Vatican. Father Gabriele Amorth is seated across from a middle-aged woman who has traveled from a small town in northern Italy. She arrived with her husband and a local priest who has known her for 20 years. That priest told Amorth before they entered the room that this woman was not always like this, that something changed in her 18 months ago, that she can no longer enter a church without something inside her resisting with a violence she herself cannot explain. Amorth began the session with the standard prayers. The woman was quiet, cooperative, and then, at the moment, Amorth pronounced the name of Christ with the authority of exorcism. The voice changed, not gradually, instantly. What began speaking was not the woman. Amorth asked a direct question. He asked what was present where it had been before entering this woman. The answer he received, which he documented word by word in his private records and cited partially in his published books, is what I want to walk you through today. Because what that voice described in that room in Rome in 1987 was not a theological abstraction. It was a physical, sequential, detailed description of a place. And every element of what was described is confirmed with precision in the biblical text when you go to the original Greek and Hebrew and read what the words actually say. I am 79 years old. I spent 4 decades reading the records of exorcists, the diaries of mystics, the documents the church collected that rarely make it to a pulpit. I read both of Amorth's published books in Italian before they were translated. I read the accounts of the priests who assisted at his sessions and signed their witness testimonies. And what I'm going to walk through today is not what I think happens after death. It is what a source that had no reason to lie about the subject described when it was compelled to answer with truth. Before I go to what was said, you need to understand who Father Amorth was and why that matters enormously. Father Gabriele Amorth was the chief exorcist of the Vatican for more than 30 years. He performed over 70,000 exorcisms across his lifetime. Not 60, not 100, 70,000. He was not a parish priest who occasionally dealt with unusual cases. He was a specialist with decades of documented experience, supervised by the Church, investigated by the Church, and authorized by the Church to continue his work until his death in 2016 at the age of 91. Here is the detail most people do not know. Demons tried to avoid Father Amorth specifically. During exorcisms performed by other priests, when the presence was interrogated about why it resisted Amorth's name more than others, the answer that appeared repeatedly was that he knew the right questions, that he would not settle for vague answers, that he pressed with scriptural authority and knowledge in a way that made evasion more difficult. The exorcism, within Catholic theology, and according to what the biblical text itself indicates, creates a condition in which the demonic presence is compelled by the authority of Christ to answer truthfully when directly interrogated by an authorized minister. Amorth understood this and exploited it methodically. What that voice described in Rome in 1987 about hell came in response to direct questions. It was not a spontaneous revelation. It was extracted, word by word, from a source that clearly did not want to discuss the subject, and what was said came in 4 distinct parts that Amorth documented separately in his records. The first thing the voice described was the absence, not the fire, not the physical torment, the absence. And Amorth recorded that when he pressed for more details about what that absence meant in practice, what he received was something he said stayed with him for the rest of his life. The voice said that every being that exists within creation, including those most removed from God, including those who never thought of him, including those who actively denied him, exists within a universe that still carries the presence of God in its structure. That the very existence of matter, of time, of consciousness, of the capacity to experience anything at all, is a form of divine presence that cannot be completely removed from anything that exists within creation. In hell, that presence is removed, completely. What remains is a fully functional consciousness, completely awake, capable of thinking and feeling and remembering with absolute clarity, operating in a space from which the only thing that sustains the experience of existing has been withdrawn. The voice could not describe what that means in terms that human language can contain. What Amorth recorded was that the demonic presence interrupted its own attempt to describe it and fell silent for several minutes before continuing. I want you to read 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9. Paul writes that the punishment of those who reject God will be eternal destruction, separated from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. The phrase separated from the presence of the Lord in Greek is apo prosopo tou Kyriou, literally removed from the face of the Lord, not distanced, removed. The distinction is total. What the voice described in 1987 is contained in that Pauline phrase with a precision that Amorth commented on explicitly in his writings. The second thing the voice described was time, or more precisely, the absence of time as human beings experience it. Amorth asked directly how time functioned in hell. The answer he received and recorded with the exact phrase was this: the future has been murdered. Every moment in hell is identical to every other moment that has existed, and to every moment that will exist. There is no tomorrow that can be different from today. There is no next week in which the situation might change. There is no temporal structure that allows the experience of approaching anything different from what already is. Human beings endure present suffering because time moves forward, because tomorrow exists as possibility. The capacity to imagine a different future is the fundamental mechanism by which human consciousness survives present suffering. Remove the future, not as circumstance but as category, and what remains is a suffering without the only mechanism that would make it possible to endure. Mark chapter 9 verse 48, Jesus, quoting Isaiah 66, "Where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched." The language of not quenched is not only intensity, it is permanence without possibility of extinction. The fire that does not end, because the time that would end, it does not exist. The third thing the voice described was memory. And here Amorth recorded that the demonic presence hesitated before responding in a way he had never seen before. Not the hesitation of resistance, the hesitation of something that did not want to revisit what it was about to describe. Memory in hell is complete and permanent. Every moment in which a choice was made against God, every specific moment, with all its context, with full consciousness of what was being chosen and what was being rejected, is available with absolute and permanent clarity. Not as human memory that softens with time, that distorts, that mercifully erases details. As an immediate and present awareness of every point of choice, seen in the light of a complete understanding of what those choices meant. An understanding that in this life is partial and in hell is total. Amorth recorded that when he pressed the presence about what this meant in practical terms, he received an answer that made him stop the session for several minutes. The voice said that seeing oneself completely, seeing every choice, every moment, every rejection, without the mercy that in this life softens the perception of oneself, is the fire the Bible calls eternal. Not a metaphor, a reality of consciousness that burns without consuming, because the consciousness being burned cannot be destroyed. Luke chapter 16 verses 19 through 31. The rich man in hell has complete memory. He remembers his brothers. He remembers Lazarus. He understands completely where he is and how he got there. Abraham tells him that between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. The chasm is not geographical, it is ontological. It is the distance between a state that still has a future and a state from which the future has been removed. The fourth thing the voice described was the company. And here, the description diverges completely from what popular imagination associates with hell. The voice did not describe solitude, it described the opposite. Hell is inhabited densely, and every being that inhabits it carries within itself the total absence of love. Not as sadness at the absence, but as its replacement by something that Amorth recorded as anger, without object and hatred without direction that turns toward any nearby presence simply because it is presence. The voice said that in hell there is no possible separation between those who are there. No privacy, no silence, no moment of isolation that would in itself be a form of relief. The proximity is constant, and the nature of what each presence carries means that this constant proximity is the opposite of any consolation. It is what Jesus describes in Matthew chapter 8 verse 12 as the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The gnashing of teeth is not physical pain. It is the specific expression of rage and hopeless despair that the voice described as the constant and inescapable atmosphere of hell. Now I want you to do something. I want you to read Luke 16:19-31 with all of this in mind, not as a parable about the importance of helping the poor, as a literal description of a real state that a real being is experiencing. The rich man has consciousness, he has memory, he has affection. He asks that someone warn his brothers. He has understanding of what happened and why it happened. Abraham does not tell him his situation is not real, or that it will eventually change. He tells him there is a chasm that cannot be crossed. The permanence is not implied. It is stated directly by the character Jesus chose to represent divine mercy in that story. What Father Amorth documented across decades of exorcisms does not contradict the biblical text at any point. It confirms it with a specificity that comes from a source that was not trying to confirm the Bible. It was answering direct questions about its own experience and origin. The alignment between what demons described under compulsion and what the biblical text says when read in the original Greek and Hebrew is what Amorth cited repeatedly as the reason he kept publishing these accounts despite pressure to stop. He was questioned many times during his life about why he published such disturbing material. His answer was always the same version of the same thing: that the enemy's greatest victory in the 20th century was not possession. It was convincing the educated and progressive world that he did not exist, that hell was a medieval invention for controlling ignorant populations, that the language of eternal consequences was incompatible with a God of love, and therefore had to be reinterpreted as metaphor or dismissed as primitive. Every preacher who replaces the reality of hell with a vague reference to separation without explaining what that separation means in practice is, in Amorth's words, doing the enemy's work without knowing it. I am not telling you this to create fear. Fear is not the point, and it never was the point. Father Amorth did not publish these accounts to terrorize people. He published them because he believed that the reality of what is at stake is the only context within which the mercy of God carries its full weight. You cannot fully understand what Christ did on the cross without some awareness of what he was preventing. Mercy without the weight of what it rescued is sentimentality. It is not the gospel. What that voice described in that room in Rome in 1987, the absence, the murdered future, the memory without mercy, the company without love, is the place from which Christ descended to rescue those who believe in him. It is the context within which John 3:16 carries its real weight. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that whoever believes in him shall not perish. The word perish in that verse is not abstract, it has content. And Father Amorth spent 30 years documenting part of that content from a source that was, ironically, the most honest about the subject, precisely because it had no reason to soften it. Father Amorth died in 2016. His books exist, his interviews are recorded, his records have been partially preserved. If you have never read what he documented, I want you to start this week. Not because it will terrify you, because it will change the quality of your attention to what you do with the time you have. Leave a word in the comments. Just one word. You do not need to explain anything. I will understand what it means. Subscribe to this channel because there is much more to go through. The records of St. Faustina that the Vatican nearly sealed, the prophetic dreams of St. John Bosco, the texts the early church read about what waits beyond this life. We are only beginning. Press like so that someone who needs to hear this tonight can find their way here. My time to go through these things is limited. I do not intend to waste any of it.